Thanks for the opportunity to be a part of Elevate. I know over the last year, you've covered so many different topics in this forum, in this setting, as leaders, and have been being developed and growing. And I'm just excited to be a part of this and add to the discussion. But just a shout out to the leadership. Thank you for creating this space to develop leaders within our community. I love the heart behind it and excited for the impact that it's going to have in our Indian churches and beyond, right? So as Josh mentioned just a little bit ago tonight, I want to focus our attention on the topic of knowing your audience, all right? Now, my wife, Blessing, and I, we live in Oklahoma. We've got 3 boys. Judah is 11 years old, Josiah is 9 years old, and Levi is 4 years old. And when our middle son, Josiah, was around 3 years old, I remember he went to church, and when we picked him up, he was so excited to tell us what he learned about that day, and we were equally excited to hear it. It was a classic story. It's one that we all know, David and Goliath. He was so excited to tell us, and it was giving us all the details. Goliath was this big, huge, strong giant, and David was this young, small little boy. And as he continued the story, he says Goliath was just standing there, but this young little boy took a rock, threw it at Goliath, and it killed him. And because of that, David was a bad guy and Goliath was a good guy. We were like, wait, what? He's like, yeah, David's bad because we're not supposed to throw rocks at people. And because he did this, God is not happy with him. And I think my wife and I, we both just froze in that moment because we'd never heard the story like that before. But somehow this teacher had communicated the story, but the message got lost in translation. Now, everyone is a communicator, okay? We often ascribe the title of communicators to those that professionally do it, those that have like a platform or speak from the stage, those that talk in front of crowds. And yes, those are communicators, but really so is everyone else who is constantly communicating, which is every one of us, right? Parents to children and vice versa, boss to employees and vice versa, classmates, colleagues, friends, small groups, teams. Wherever communication is happening in whatever setting, it involves communicators like you and me engaging with others. And often much of this engagement may be conversational in nature, and you may not give any forethought to it, but before uttering a word or communicating something in writing, if we can start by putting ourselves in the shoes of those on the other side of what we're saying, it can make all the difference in the world. I think John Maxwell's book title sums it up best. It says, everyone communicates, but few connect. And that's what we're addressing today. How can we bridge the gap between communication and connection? All right. How can we bridge that gap? So what I want you to think about before we jump in this evening is who are the different audiences that you're communicating to? Your church, social settings, at work, family. Who are the different audiences that you communicate to, and how well do you know them? Because the truth is, the better that you know your audience, the more effective you will be in bringing about your desired outcome. Now, this outcome could be moving people to action on a particular subject. It could be helping them to see a situation differently. Maybe it's trying to shift the way they approach a particular matter. In the church context, it could be helping folks to see the scriptures clearly and how it applies to their lives. For all of these, knowing the listener makes all the difference in the world. But I think all too often what happens is we can get so focused on what we want to communicate that it overshadows who we're communicating to. The what being the information we want to dispense. We study, we prep, we consume content, we gather data, we put all the pieces together so we can articulate a particular point or a message. But if you want to see change, if you want to see results, this isn't going to come through information, but rather through inspiration. And the only way that you can inspire others is by knowing who they are. Now, before diving into some specifics, I want to start with the scriptures, because we see some great examples of knowing your audience on display in the scriptures. I want to start with the Apostle Paul for a moment, okay? The brilliant, wise evangelist who wrote much of the New Testament. One of the things that you don't see Paul doing is he doesn't take a one-size-fits-all approach in his communication. Rather, he always made it a point to understand his audience, and then he crafted his message carefully so that listeners would have the best possible chance of receiving the good news. We see it in his writings. Look at the epistles, the letters to the churches, different audiences in different settings. And we can see he understood their context, where they were located, the challenges or struggles they had. And although the gospel, it never changed, Paul used illustrations and imagery to connect the dots for readers and to help them apply the truths to their lives. But not only did he do this in his writings, he actually did this also when he spoke. Like when we come to Acts 25, Acts 26, Paul had been in prison for years at this point, and he was called upon to present a defense for why he believes what he believes and why he does what he does. Okay? So we're going to see this in Acts 25, verse 23, and I'll have the verse pulled up here on the screen so you can see it. Here's what it says. The next day, Agrippa, who was the king, and Bernice, his wife, came with great pomp and entered the audience room with high-ranking military officers and the prominent men of the city. At the command of Festus, who was the governor, Paul was brought in. So who is Paul standing in front of? Who is his audience? We see from this text that it's an elite group of high-ranking leaders and officials, which included the king of the Jews. And the king in particular is who Paul is going to focus his attention on. Now look at verse 1, Acts 26, verse 1. So Agrippa, the king, said to Paul, "You have permission to speak for yourself." And then it says, Paul stretched out his hand and made his defense. Now I want to pause right there for a moment because I don't want you to miss what Paul does right at the outset. It says, what does he do? He stretched out his hand. Now, in his day, this is what great speakers would do when starting a speech. So what Paul is doing here is he is setting the tone. He's seeking the respect from this elite group with this gesture before he uttered a word. He stretched out his hand and then he makes his defense. All right, then he says this in verse 2. I consider myself fortunate that it's before you, King Agrippa. I'm going to make my defense today against all the accusations of the Jews, especially because you're familiar with all the customs and controversies of the Jews. Therefore, I beg you to listen to me patiently. Now, as you read that, you may not think much of it. It may sound just like, oh, that's an intro. But what Paul is doing here, it's a tactic that Roman orators use, and it's called captatio benevolentia. All right, that's a mouthful right there. Say that 10 times. Captatio benevolentia. It's capturing the goodwill of the audience. By Paul being respectful and acknowledging the king's substantial knowledge of the issues at hand, this would have won him favor in presenting his case. So in just a few words, Paul highlights the king's Jewish identity and familiarity with Jewish tradition. He does this knowing it's going to connect. It's going to give him credibility and be rightly understood by his audience, who is King Agrippa, the Jewish king. And then he'll jump into his defense. Now, as we read the scriptures, Paul's going to go on to share his testimony, his zealousness for Judaism, and his conversion story. All right? We see another example of Paul exercising this connection to his audience and knowing his audience when he speaks. And we see this in Acts chapter 17, okay? This time, Paul is in Athens, and he's speaking at the Areopagus or Mars Hill. This was where respected leaders and philosophers would gather to discuss spiritual or philosophical ideas, and they were primarily interested in defending the Greek concept of the gods, the Greek gods, right? So the leaders hear about what Paul has been teaching in their synagogue and in the public square, and they wanted to hear for themselves, what is this guy talking about? What is he teaching? We want to know for ourselves. So they bring him to Mars Hill, and they put the spotlight on him. Let's look at Acts chapter 17, verse 22. So Paul, standing before the council, addressed them as follows. Men of Athens, I notice that you are very religious in every way. Now let's pause there for a moment. How would Paul know that they were religious? This observation had to come from him studying and knowing his audience, right? So he says that. And then we go on to verse 23. For as I was walking along, I saw your many shrines, and one of your altars had the inscription on it, to an unknown God. This is the God whom you worship without knowing. This is the one that I'm telling you about. And then what he does is he goes on talking about God and hits out aspects of God as creator, ruler, and judge. Now, notice the difference between Acts 17, what we just looked at, and how he got into his speech in Acts 26, which we looked at earlier. His connection point in Acts 26 to a Jewish audience was through his Jewish roots. But in Acts 17 to philosophers in Athens, his connection point was their unknown God. Paul would later in Acts 17 even quote directly from ancient Greek poetic literature to connect with his audience. You see, Paul knew in order to effectively communicate the gospel, he had to connect with his audience. But the Apostle Paul, he wasn't the only one that understood this. Jesus recognized it too. When he spoke to different groups, he understood his audience and spoke to them accordingly. Think about it for a moment. When Jesus was in front of large crowds, we see him using parables and stories. When he spoke to his disciples, he gave more insight and explanation than in the larger setting. He answered questions that they had. What about the core three, Peter, James, and John? You see more intimate conversations happening, and there were moments like the Mount of Transfiguration, these kind of intimate moments where Jesus is speaking to just the three. The Pharisees, though, when Jesus spoke to them, he rebuked them and called them out because they knew the truth but had misapplied it and they needed correction. Jesus understood knowing his audience, right? Communication is important, but connection is what makes communication effective and impactful. So, how can we connect? It's by knowing who they are, knowing your audience. So, what are the things that you need to consider and think through when looking at who is on the other side of what you are saying? I want to hit on 3 areas this evening that, regardless of size, it could be 500 people, 50 people, 5 people, or just one person. I want to give you 3 areas for you to consider in regard to your audience that can make a big difference. And then afterwards, we're going to look at how we can actually apply that. Okay, so first, let me give you 3 areas to consider in regard to knowing your audience. The first thing is you want to know their background. The first thing to consider is you got to know their background. See, the way that I talk to someone from our Indian background is different from someone from a Caucasian background or a Hispanic background or an African background. It's different from culture to culture because a person's understanding on a particular topic differs from one group to another. People's upbringing, their background, it's shaped their worldview. And if we fail to understand this, we're going to fail to connect with them. Now, I'm going to make some broad generalizations here because based on observation for the sake of the talk, but it's not meant to say every single person is like this. And you may point out examples that show me otherwise. But again, remember, we're talking broadly here. Okay. Now, I remember when I was talking to a Caucasian friend of mine about family, and this is when I was living in Springfield, Missouri. My extended family was in Oklahoma City, and we would visit them often, or they would come see us. My friend was like, man, you guys are really close with your family. And that's so weird because I haven't seen my grandparents in like 3 years. My sister, it's been about a year, and my first cousin, it's been like 10 years since I've seen them. But it seems like for you, Tom, you see your family like every single week. Now, I was like, wait, what? You haven't seen your folks in how long? And mind you, this wasn't because they lived in another country, because I know some of you are probably like, yeah, that's true for me too, because I've got family that lives in India, and yeah, I haven't seen them in a while either. No. In this case, the people that he mentioned, his sister, his grandparents, his cousins, they were just a few states away, right? But that concept of being close with your family is just foreign to him. However, in most cultures outside of Europe and America, family is a central part of culture. You see it in Hispanic cultures, Asian cultures. This is why even after we're 18, after college, even into adulthood, our parents will still welcome us to their house, which isn't the case with Caucasians. You're 18, get out of here, right? So why is this important? Well, if you're talking to a group of Caucasians about family, the way that you view family relations is not going to be the same way they view it. So you need to flesh this out, explain what you mean by it, and not assume they understand what you're trying to convey. It's the same word, family, but it looks different depending on your background. So you're going to want to give some explanation. You're going to want to give some insight into what you mean when you use that term. Let's take the phrase, I love you. Okay. I love you. When Americans learn that I've never heard my parents say, I love you to me or my brother, they get all worried and sad. They're like, I'm so sorry you were deprived of that. You must have some deep emotional wounds because you've never heard your parents say that. But the truth is, in our culture growing up, now this has changed now because I do tell my kids, my wife and I, we say, I love you to them, right? But growing up, we knew that the way that our parents loved us is that they showed it in their actions, not by saying it. In fact, if they did say it, then we would be like, who's dying? What's happening? Something's wrong. Something's going on here, right? Because you just don't do that. See, when looking at who you're talking to, it's important to try to get an understanding of their background or their upbringing. Asking questions such as, what kind of home were they raised in? How many siblings do they have? And where do they land on the birth order? What part of the country did they grow up in? East Coast, West Coast, Midwest, born in India or another country? Who were influential people in their lives? Their mom, their dad, teacher, coach, pastor. You see, being informed by with this kind of information, it allows you to better craft what you're going to say so that the message directly hits home in a way that makes sense to the listener. A quick side note, we recently did this as a church staff. Even though we had known bits and pieces of each other, we hadn't really dove into one another's origin story. And so we got together, everyone together, and we answered questions like the ones I mentioned above. And the revelations that came out of it not only helps us understand each other better, but it's already improved how we communicate with one another in light of what we know. Now, if you're speaking to a crowd, you're not going to be able to answer these questions for all the people. You're not going to be able to just sit down with every person and be like, oh, okay, let me ask you these questions, right? But if you can have an overview of the crowd in relation to the questions that I mentioned, it's going to be helpful. I like what a friend of mine who's a pastor, I like what he does, right? When writing his sermon, he thinks of 3 or 4 individuals from his congregation that would be representative of a larger group of people in the church. In other words, there would be a good number of people in the congregation that could relate to or be similar to these 3 or 4 individuals. And then when he's writing his messages, he looks to see how what he is saying connects with those 3 or 4 folks, because he knows if he can connect with them, he can connect with others that are similar to them. I'll show you what this looks like, okay? Let's say there's a couple in his congregation. Their name is Jim and Susie. They're middle-aged, they've got 2 kids, middle-class, blue-collar folks. And so as he's crafting his message, he's asking, how would what I'm saying and how I'm saying it connect with this particular family? Am I saying it at a level that they can understand, or am I talking over them? Is the application clear for them to put it into practice? See, when he considers this family in writing his sermon, he's also able to connect with other families too that are also middle-aged, blue-collar workers that have a few kids. But you see, he can't only focus on that couple, because also in his audience is Lily. She's in her 60s and she's single and retired. He needs to consider her and those in a similar boat to her. But then he can't forget Mark. Mark's a new grad, young professional, working his first job, just figuring out adulting. You got to consider Mark and people like him at the church too. I think you're catching what I'm saying, right? Now, speaking directly to our Indian congregations, it's important to be mindful that our audience is multi-generational. We've got first and second generation Indian Americans. We have parents and grandparents that grew up in a different lifestyle than the American way of living. It's important that we take that into consideration when we speak in our congregations. I would also add, when You're using examples or illustrations, be mindful of the kind of folks in your congregation. For example, if you're only using manly jokes or illustrations, then it's not going to connect with the females in the audience. If all your jokes are engineering related and about gears or physics laws, then your nurses and medical professionals are going to be left in the dark, okay? Now, it's not about avoiding these at all costs. It's not about that. It's not saying don't do it at all. But it's just saying, hey, you got to broaden your approach because you have a broader audience, right? If you got a few illustrations, try mixing it up. Don't make it all under this niche category. All right, that's what I'm getting at. See, when we take time to filter what we're saying through the lens of others of different backgrounds and different stages of life, we're able to shape our message in a way that'll greatly impact listeners. So, uncovering the backstory of a person and understanding their stage of life will be super beneficial to you as a communicator. The second thing that we want to consider or think about as it relates to knowing our audience is we need to discover their personality types. We need to discover their personality types. All of us are uniquely wired, different strengths, weaknesses, proclivities, tendencies, what we're naturally bent towards. It differs from person to person. And often when I'm talking to folks, they may recognize certain things about themselves, but unless they've gone through a season of self-discovery, they haven't identified or connected the dots on the way they're wired. So I'm a big proponent of personality tests. Personality tests, they're assessments based on your responses. It spits out a summary of how you process things, your inclinations, what you're like when you're healthy, what you're like when you're not, and so forth. Now, the key here is you must answer the questions honestly, who you actually are, not who you want to be, who you really are, if you want to get accurate results. Now, I do want to put this disclaimer. One of the pitfalls of personality tests that I've seen people do is they use it as a crutch to keep themselves from growing. Oh, I'm an introvert, so I can just isolate myself from people because that's how I'm wired. On the flip side, I'm an extrovert, so I always need to be around people and I can't have quiet time alone, okay? Just because you're naturally bent a certain way, it isn't an excuse to keep you from growing and developing. Introverts, you need to talk to people in order to fulfill the Great Commission because you got to tell people about Jesus, right? Extroverts, you need quiet time with the Lord so that you can drown out all the noise and actually hear him speak to you. So I would highly recommend you take personality tests if you haven't for yourself and discover who you are, but also don't let it limit you. Now, when it comes to knowing your audience, it's helpful for you to have an idea of the personality types that you're speaking to or that you are leading. The church that I was at previously, our staff took the Enneagram test and we knew our individual numbers, of course. But we also knew those of our immediate team members and those of our leaders. This was super helpful because it allowed me to go into meetings and present things in a way that was going to be most effective. Now, I'll show you what I mean. If I'm talking to a visionary type, a big picture type of person, I want to avoid getting into all the minutia and all the details because it's going to bore them to death and they're going to get so lost in the detail that it's probably not going to lead them to making a good decision, right? However, if there's someone that's a detail-oriented person, and if you're talking big picture vision and talking from a 30,000-foot level, but you haven't gone over how it's going to be executed and the details involved with making it happen, that person is not going to feel informed to make a good decision. I mean, think about it. For that big picture thinker, you can just take them to a piece of property and be like, oh, we're going to build this building here and it's going to be awesome and people are going to come from all over and it's going to be great. The location's great. Just think about it. Take in the sights and sounds and smells. It's going to be awesome. That's all that they need. But if you do that with the detail-oriented person and you take them to the land and you say, oh, it's going to be awesome. This is great. They're going to stand there and look at you like you're crazy because they want to know exactly where the building is going to be located and what direction is the front door going to be facing. How is that going to be? How does the traffic flow and egress and ingress? What does that look like? I mean, how is it going to be when we have large gatherings? Where's the parking lot going to go? You see what I'm saying? So you got to be able to know who you're talking to and what type of person they are, what their personality type is like, if you're going to be effective in communicating with them. All right. You've got to know how people are wired, what makes them tick, how they process information, if you're going to effectively communicate with them in a way that connects. There's a lot of different personality tests that are out there, but one that I'm familiar with and have liked are the DISC assessment, Enneagram, Myers-Briggs, and EQI. Okay, so DISC, Enneagram, Myers-Briggs, and EQI. Each of these tests, they have different areas that they focus on. For example, EQI is focused on emotional intelligence. Enneagram is focused on kind of more of a personality type. Okay. But what I think is helpful when you take these tests is look at your results and learn about yourself through it, but also look at all the other results that are available and learn what it looks like for each of those other categories as well. So with the Enneagram, for example, I'm a 3. That's the achiever performer. Okay. Rather than just being familiar with all that a 3 entails, I've looked at all the other 8 options that are possible as well and began studying those and what it entailed. Because when you do that, then you're going to be able to identify the qualities and traits that you see in others and be able to say, oh, that's what that person is like. That's what that person is similar to. And again, you can tailor your communication in a way that's going to be effective for that particular personality type, that individual. Okay. So background is important. Personality type is important. The third thing that we want to be able to look at is we got to identify their present needs. Okay. Identify their present needs. What are the present realities of the people that you are talking to? Let's say this is in a one-on-one setting with a boss or a colleague. Let's just say that they have a family member that's ill and in the hospital. Now may not be the best time to put something in front of them where they have to make a major decision because they're not in the right frame of mind to do it, right? Now, looking at this from more of an audience setting, it could be a stressful season in the community because it's the start of a new school year and people are getting back from summer break. Or maybe it's positive and your sports team is doing well, and so the whole community is buzzing like in Boston right now, right? It could be a pandemic and people are scared and worried and freaking out. Now, it doesn't mean your whole talk needs to revolve around this issue, but if we're not sensitive to it, when we don't acknowledge or touch on the topic or even allow it to inform the way we craft the message, we miss out on the opportunity to be able to speak into a situation that's really weighing heavily on people. Even when you look at Jesus' ministry, he was meeting present needs and then going beyond that. He would heal physically and also spiritually. He would speak to a particular issue, but then speak on eternal life. You've got to meet people where they're at in your communication and then move them to a better place. President Theodore Roosevelt, he says, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. Knowing your audience allows you to communicate from a place of caring for those on the other side of what you're saying. So we've talked so far about knowing your audience. I want to shift our attention for the next few moments and focus on the now what part. What do you do with what you've uncovered? What does it mean to know your audience? And when it comes to communication, like how should we process this? What do we do with what we have found? Now, I know that in Elevate, you've already had a session on communication. And if you missed that, be sure and check it out. So this isn't a deep dive on the topic of communication, but just wanted to give you a few things to consider when speaking in light of knowing your audience. The first thing to consider is this: you want to find common ground. You want to find common ground. Gary V, businessman, media personality, he says, it doesn't matter what you're selling, it doesn't matter what you're saying until you get their attention. Why should someone listen to you? This is where the initial hook of some kind is important in communication. And doing that work of knowing your audience allows you to find an appropriate hook that's going to catch and draw people into what you're saying. For example, if I'm speaking to a group of college students, starting with an illustration that's about kids and parenthood is probably not going to be the most effective. Now I'm not saying it's completely off limits because you can tell the story in a way that captivates them, but by and large, if you can find an illustration that meets them right where they're at or where they have been, this is going to allow for them to have a greater connection to that illustration, which in turn is going to allow them to have a greater connection with you. Now, this common ground isn't just at the beginning, but throughout your talk. Look for links, look for bridges between what you've uncovered about your audience and the message that you're trying to communicate. A message that resonates with an audience is going to stick with them longer. A second thing is you want to answer these two questions when you're speaking. What do I want them to know? What do I want them to do? What do I want them to know? What do I want them to do? Now, I want to use a sermon or a message as an example here, okay? When you're prepping for a message, you may spend 8 to 10, maybe even 15 hours getting ready for a 30 to 40-minute talk. So in that prep time, you're consuming all sorts of content and gaining insights through commentaries or listening to other communicators. Inevitably, you're going to want to tell everybody everything that you've learned because of the effect that it's having on you and how it's impacting you. But if let's say you're spending 10 hours prepping, okay, that's 600 minutes. You're taking 600 minutes mulling over this topic. This is studying, writing, practicing, all that stuff. But you've spent 600 minutes that whole time letting this settle in your heart. But now you only have a 30 to 40-minute window to speak to an audience that has not been thinking about what you're saying at all. This is the first time it's even coming to their minds, the topic that you're bringing to their attention. So the question is, what do you want them to know? You can't tell them everything, right? You can't take 600 minutes of dwelling and processing and all of those things and cram it into 30, 40-minute window. So what do you want them to know? What do they need to know? Then you got to think, am I just here to disseminate information and fill their already full minds with more content that's probably just going to get lost? Or do I want to move people to action? What do you want them to do? Maybe you're teaching on prayer, okay? This is something that people inside and outside the church are familiar with. Why does someone need to listen to another talk on this topic, especially from you? You got to answer the questions. What do you want them to do? Why should they listen? What are you asking to do? That's different. Let me give you some options to consider. Maybe you want them to pray with an increased faith that God can do what he said he could do. Maybe you want them to pray from a place of genuine relationship and intimacy with the Heavenly Father. It could be that you want to move them from a rote and ritualistic prayer life to experiencing a dynamic and powerful prayer life. You have to identify what it is you want them to do and then be able to drive that point home. What do you want them to know? What do you want them to do? Something else to think about when communicating is you got to read the room. You got to read the room. Let's say you're in a small room speaking to a group of like 5 to 6 people. If you're slamming your hands super loud and your voice is as loud as it can be and you're very demonstrative, then you're probably going to push people away. Because in that setting, it's an intimate setting. They're expecting it to be more conversational in tone and nature. And when it doesn't feel that way, you distance people instead of drawing them in. On the flip side, if you're speaking in a larger room, say 100 or 200 people, and you're speaking like you would in a small setting with just a few people, this is going to create a disconnect because a room or setting like this needs you to have more energy and for you to be more dynamic. Now, this isn't saying don't be true to yourself. It's not even an extrovert or introvert thing. Rather, it's be conscientious about the room that you're in and channel your energy and tone and demeanor in a way that allows you to be most effective. You got to change your mode of communication to match the room, not change who you are, but how you're delivering the message. And then finally, something else to think about when communicating is you got to seek to inspire. Seek to inspire. Maya Angelou said, I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. An important aspect of communication that can't be overlooked is inspiration. People don't want to be told what to do or guilted into doing something, but if you can inspire them, it will draw them to action. See, people connect with people. So if you have stories or testimonies you can incorporate into what you're saying, that's very impactful. If you can illustrate or connect a visual with what you're saying, that's highly effective. Information is good to acquire, but inspiration is what leads to transformation. So as we wrap up, remember, when we're communicating, we always have an audience that we're communicating to. The better that we know that audience, and in turn, craft our message, tailor our message in a way that connects, the more effective and the more impactful that we can be as communicators, regardless of setting, in church, outside of church, in work, and communicating with friends, in everything that we're doing, we can be impactful and effective when we know our audience. Thanks. Alvin, you can go ahead and take it away, man.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tom. That was a great session. I was taking so many notes. I just want to thank you so much for everything you're sharing. That was awesome. I learned so much. And just before we move on to the next session, I just wanted to remind everyone about the Q&A. If you could, you can either just text me, text Josh, or put it straight into the chat. Any questions you were wondering. And then with that, I want to hand it off to announcements.
That would be me, I think. So thank you. Thanks, Alvin. Thanks, Pastor Tom. That was amazing. So information is good, but inspiration is what leads people to transformation. And so that's what you ended off with, and that's something I'll take with me, and a lot of things that I learned today. So thank you so much. I appreciate you taking this time, and inspiring the leaders, the various folks that are here. So thank you so much. As we know, Elevate's been a session that's been going on for the last few months, and we hope to continue it even into next month, the month right before the conference. And so we will have more information coming up about that. Just have a couple of announcements. I won't take too long, but please send those questions in to Alvin. The IPC family conference will take place, as you know, August 8th through the 11th in Boston, in Boxborough Regency Hotel. And so if you are in the area, and please come on out and support in any way that you can. If you can come out, you can see it on various medias. As well. There'll be a basketball tournament. There is various medical seminars with a parachurch organization called Life. And the topics they'll be addressing will be health and identity challenges, and we'll be going into some of the difficult topics like gender identity and other things as well. The whole topic will be concerning spiritual encounters in medical practice, and as well as we'll be talking about end of life and caregiving issues. So many physicians from the community will be coming out and talking about these topics. Along with us, there'll be mental health seminars, family and marriage seminars, and sports tournament Friday morning, along with sessions for ladies and kids, as well as worship from Justice Tamps from Dallas and Sean Samuel from New York for the youth sessions. So please come on out and support in every way that you can. There will be a leadership pre-conference as well that'll take place on 7th and the 8th at the same hotel. So if you can come out early, if you're a leader in any way, please make every effort to attend that as well. The accommodations and meals are only $100 for that. There'll be also some recognition of people that have been doing missions over the last few decades in our community. So if you have anyone to nominate, please nominate by the end of the month. We will certainly consider those folks. The location where the conference will take place, the Boxborough Regency, is already sold out, but there's about 50 rooms left in a nearby 10-12 minute away brand new hotel with about 50 rooms left. So if you want the discounted rate, please register within the next few days to have that opportunity. You have opportunity if you want to put songbook advertisements, as well as we're in need of sponsors as well. So please look at the website, ipcfamilyconference.org, if you have the opportunity for that. So thank you all for being here today. I don't want to take up too much time, but we'll give it back to Alvin, and he's already kind of curated the questions that have come along. Some have been sent to him privately, and so we'll have a time of question and answer session. And for that, I'll hand it back to Alvin Thompson.
Awesome, thank you. So we got a wide range of questions, and even as I'm asking this, I encourage you guys, if you have any questions that comes up even midst our conversation, just send it into the chat. Okay, awesome. So we have a wide range of topics around connecting to people. I think the first question I want to ask that a lot of people have been wondering is, how do you keep the balance between connecting with people for the gospel, but not compromising the message?
Right. I think on that, Paul is a perfect example of this, right? When you look at the Apostle Paul, he never compromised his faith. You don't have to water down the truth in order to connect. Now, too often, I think that word being relevant gets overused, but the idea behind relevant is to connect the dots between the truth and where people are at. It doesn't mean that you're bringing the truth down to their level. It's how do you bring them to the level of that truth, right? So I think what you've got to look at it's kind of how I would say Paul would do it. He never compromised the truth, but even in his illustrations, he talks about running a race. He uses pictures, he uses imagery that they would understand, but his message it never changed. So for us, that's something that we've got to look at, right? Essentially it's looking like this, right? The methodology can change, but the message should never change, right? So when you take music, for example, we're in an MP3 generation. That's the day that we're not even in that. We're streaming at this point, right? So you think about it, we're streaming music at this point. But back in the day, they used to have 8-track and they used to have records. Records are still around today. So the medium or how that music was conveyed looked different, but at its core, it's still music. Right? So in that same way, the how should change, and that changes with your audience. And even in this day and age, like I was saying, you might have a college audience, you might have younger folks than that, you might have older folks. So you want to look at how to connect the dots in a way that's understandable for them, but you got to be taking that truth. And that should never stay. It's the gospel is the gospel. The Bible, it's the inerrant word of God, right? It should never be compromised. So I think it's in the approach and it's in the how. And if ever you're feeling like the word is being compromised, I mean, that's the focus. The truth cannot be changed.
Right. Awesome. Beautiful. I think that's a good segue into the next couple of questions, which is trying to connect with difficult people. So one of the questions that came forth was, how do you communicate with teens or young adults who feel like they know it all and you have a hard time getting through to them?
All right. With those audiences like that's there, you do the best that you can, and then you have to leave the rest up to them, right? There's a saying, you can lead a horse to the water, but you can't force it to drink, right? So the idea is, what am I doing? Have I done my part in trying to understand them, trying to connect with them? Have I done what I needed to do? So that's all that I can focus my attention on. Have I tried to study them? Have I tried to learn them? Why are they being difficult? What have I, and am I continually trying to understand that? But at the end of the day, I can't force them to receive what I'm saying. That's a choice that they have to make, right? So again, you got to know your audience. Who am I speaking to? Well, if that's who God has called me to speak, then I need to faithfully speak to that audience. I need to be a student of that audience that's there, and I got to try and do what I can, but I can't let how they respond determine if I'm a success or not.
Hmm. Right.
So my success is not predicated. It's not how effective I am is not predicated on how they respond to me. I'm going to do what I can to be able to connect and for them to receive it well. But if they don't respond in the right way, I can't control that because I cannot force them to do that. And especially with people like that are difficult, what you got to know is this: you're just planting seeds. It may be that they're not receiving it now, but you still need to give the word that God has given you and laid on your heart for that audience, and then let the Holy Spirit do the work. And I've seen that in my life where there's times where I've thought people weren't listening or they weren't paying attention. And then I don't know, 10 years later, they're like, oh, I remember this. And when you said this, and I'm like, what are you talking? I didn't think you were paying attention, you know? So it's just one of those things where you don't know. Our job is to be faithful to what we've been called to do. And then we've got to leave that part to the Holy Spirit. Their response is something we can't control.
Right. Okay. Awesome. Yeah, similarly, I was wondering, like, what if the person is predisposed to like argue with you or is argumentative? What are some ways you can lead it forward with grace and try to make sure the message gets to them, but not to offend them or to, um, to cause the issue to elevate?
Sure. I think the thing is getting to the root of why they're arguing. If they're arguing for the sake of arguing, there's no point in having that discussion, right? That's the end. It's over. You can turn it off, right? If they're looking to have a conversation, and they may be coming from an opposing viewpoint, but if they're looking to engage in a discussion and want to learn and understand, that's a different story. Now, that could come off as argumentative, but it could, if they're wanting to actually learn and grow, then that's a whole different ballgame. So I think you got to determine what is their reasoning, or what are they hoping to achieve? Because there's some people, they're just going to argue for the sake of argument. And no matter what you say, it's not, you know what I mean? It's not going to be helpful. But if it's in a setting where you're both learning from each other, even you're learning from their viewpoint and they're listening to you, that's a different place. So where are they coming from? What's their motivation? What's the motivation of their heart? Once you identify that, then you determine whether you're going to do it or you're going to engage with it or not. Because if they're just there to argue with you, then all it's going to do is lead to frustration. It's going to distance your relationship. There's no point in that. Does that make sense? So the best thing to do is just shut it off and be done with it.
Gotcha. Awesome. So another question that came forth was, how do you connect with people that you don't necessarily relate to? Like you have a hard time understanding their background. You don't really understand what you're talking to or who you're talking to. How do you navigate that?
I think a couple of things that you can do. Talk to somebody that does. Okay. Talk to someone that does. So I'm going to just use an example here. Let's just say I'm called to speak to a middle school audience. Okay. Middle school, this day and age, right? So I'm 39 years old right now, right? That's how old I am, right? So middle school audience, I don't feel like I'm in touch. I don't have any middle schoolers. What do I do? Well, the thing for me is find somebody that's in that space. Who do I know? Who's maybe a youth pastor? Who's somebody that works with kids? Who's maybe a middle school teacher? Look for the resources that are out there that can help you connect with them. Hey, and it's not a matter of trying to dress a certain way or try to be hip. That's not going to do that, right? I would actually encourage you, don't try to dress hip or cool. Just they see through that, okay? But I think having an understanding, hey, as a teacher of middle school students, what are some of the problems that they're wrestling with? What are some of the issues that they're facing? What are some of the struggles that you hear about? Okay. And then again, it's informing you as you are writing your message, right? So it's not a matter of just every word that you say is the perfect slang and it's right there with them, and that's not the point. It's, are you able to hit the needs that they're facing? Are you able to identify the struggles that they're walking through? And so I think what you've got to do, especially in this day and age, I hear what you're saying, but there's so many resources that are out there that we should try to tap into every resource available to try to find it. I mean, there's YouTube videos, understanding the generation. So I'm not saying just because you learn this, you're going to hit it out of the park and just be perfect. That's not the goal. The goal is, have you done enough so that you could at least take a few steps towards them that allows you to connect with them? Does that make sense?
Yes. Now I have a question that narrows it more, like making the scope a little more relevant. What are some of the hurdles that you see in connecting to people in the Malayali community? And then maybe other communities too, or young people living between two cultures. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing is, especially in our Indian context, there are so many variables that are there, right? You got the two cultures, for sure. That's a big thing. Like I mentioned, you've got multi-generational, right? You're speaking to Upachins and you're also speaking to kids that were born and raised here, right? So you have both of those things there. Now, again, what you do when you're in that setting is you're doing your best to not push people away, but try to connect with as many people as you can. Okay. So what you want to do is you want to be in touch with your culture. If you're going into a setting that, let's just say, is more a little bit more traditional, okay, you want to be able to talk to leaders that are in there. So if you're unfamiliar with that space, you want to talk to leaders that are there, and again, begin to identify, hey, exactly what does that audience, what does it look like, what do they need, right? And in these different settings, I mean, I think the big thing, honestly, is you're doing the best that you can to think about and identify with as many people as possible. That's kind of the goal. But you've got those variables that you've got to think through. And if you don't know, I'm all about bringing others in on the journey. It's not a solo project, right? So the kingdom of God is not a solo project. So reach out to others. Hey, maybe there's somebody in another city. Maybe there's someone in this chat that's here, that's a part of the community that you can talk to and see how they're doing it, and you kind of learn and feed and build off of one another. But the challenges are real. The challenges are there. And here's the other thing that I would say. So in our context, it's like I was talking about just a little bit ago. Don't make it so narrowly focused, right? So if you've got Upachins and Amachis that are there, and you've got all this like group that's there, don't make everything so just one-sided. See what you can to try to connect with them and add them into the mix as well. Is there something that I could hit on that they could connect to, they could relate to? Okay. And it may not be exact, but don't have a million jokes that are connected straight to a younger audience, because that's going to just leave them lost in the dark. Does that make sense? So in that case, it's just a matter of how much you're doing what you're doing. And if you're using illustrations, don't push people away. So
Awesome. Yeah. So if I got that right, it's like keep maintaining a balance, really.
that's the key. That's the key. So know who's there. Know your audience and maintain that balance. Okay, here's what this looks like, and I want to try to be able to hit everybody, because again, your goal is to do the best that you can to reach as many people as you can, right? But there's some people that you may not connect with, and that's okay. Have you done all that you can on the front end to try and do your best to connect with as many people as possible?
Awesome. Now I got a few questions on growth. One of the questions was, how do I maintain a growth mindset and get out of my comfort zones when I constantly feel like I'm not connecting with people I'm talking to?
Okay. So I want to make sure I get this clear. How can I grow in this area? I'm constantly feeling like I'm not connecting with people. What do I need to grow? Is that kind of right?
Yeah.
You got to bring other people into the journey. That's it, plain and simple. So what I mean by that is you need to invite others to watch your messages, to give you feedback. What are the blind spots? What are you missing? Invite other people on the journey. Like one of the things that I do right away after I speak is I watch myself and I do a self critique of myself. Hey, what am I doing? There was one time, like this is when I was in seminary, I was watching my video, and the whole time I never realized this, but I was swaying back and forth, right? And I'm watching myself, and it's like a pendulum. I'm like putting myself to sleep as I'm watching myself. Now, I didn't know that when I was there, but I'm watching myself and I'm like, why am I just going back to back, rocking, right? There are things that you're going to be able to identify and see when you watch yourself, but we all have blind spots. So we need to invite other people on the journey, others that we're like, okay, hey, that's somebody that I look up to that's a communicator, or someone else that's a communicator. Have them say, hey, can you watch this and give me feedback? Just and don't mention anything. Just say, hey, what's your honest feedback? Have some things for them that you want to hit on, right? Hey, my communication style, my delivery, how did I connect with the audience? Was I clear? All of those kind of things, right? You're kind of asking them, maybe have 4 or 5 specific questions, have them look at that, give them feedback and that analysis, and you've got to be ready for it, right? Without constructive feedback, you're not going to grow. Okay, so you have to make the choice. Are you willing to hear the hard stuff so that you can grow, or do you want to stay the same? Because hey, you don't have to have any feedback and you can just stay right where you're at. But if you're going to want to grow, you're going to have to hear those hard things. And honestly, that's what's allowed me to continue and develop, is hearing that feedback, getting feedback from leadership and from others telling me, hey, here's what I see you doing, your tone, your demeanor, how you're doing this. This is how you come off. You were saying something that was kind of funny, but you were very serious. And so there was a disconnect between what you were saying and your facial expression. You know what I'm saying? There's things like that that you don't even see and understand, but you've got to invite other people on the journey. So who are 2 or 3 people in your life that you're open to hearing their feedback and you're willing to take what they have to say, right? Have them watch your sermons, give you the feedback, and then you learn from it. We all have blind spots. It doesn't matter how good you are at really anything. We all have blind spots. And the only way that we're going to be able to grow is if people are able to speak into those expose those blind spots, help us to see it, and then for us to do something about it.
Awesome. So it's really part of communication is it's like a team sport. You need to understand, you need other people to give you some feedback too.
100%, 100%. You might be the soloist that's belting it out from the stage, okay? You might be the one that's there, but if you don't see this as a team sport, there could be so many things that you can't even see that that you're not doing that could make you even more effective. And not everyone's going to be able to identify that. That's why I'm saying you want to be able to get people that understand what it's like. Maybe they're speaking at a different church. Maybe they're, you know what I mean? They're communicating. So if you're speaking at your church and you've got some friends in other churches that you know, you've listened to them, you're like, man, I like their communication style. Invite them on the journey. Send a few sermons. So I do that. I've done that for myself. I do that for other people just to be able to help process that. But yeah, that's the best way. I like what you said. It's a team sport.
Awesome. Yeah, so as it's a good segue to another question someone sent is, what if you're in a team and one of the members just feels like it's just their job to deliver the word. They don't care about who's listening. How do you get them to understand how important it is to connect with others, or do you just leave it to them?
I mean, I think the thing is you challenge them and you try to help them to see the big picture. Again, you can't force them, but how can you, what I would say to that is if you've got a preaching team or a group that you're doing with, it's number one, I would say what would be nice is if you could all be in each other's corner and help each other grow and develop. Now, it doesn't mean that you're all becoming clones of one another. Okay. So one of the things that's important is when you're evaluating someone or you're getting feedback, it's not about trying to create people that are just like this person, right? In fact, I think that's a mistake, right? When you try to be like someone else instead of who you've been called to be and how you've been called to minister, then you're being inauthentic, right? So when you're on a team like this, I would say it's important for the team to be meeting regularly to be able to grow together as communicators, not just with content, but with how we're getting better. Because, hey, the generations are changing, our audience is changing, the needs are changing, right? Things are going on. Maybe there's, I don't know, maybe there's a lot of people that are sick in your congregation right now, right? For you as a preaching team to be able to come together and say, okay, this is what we're seeing. We're getting a lot of prayer requests, and here's what they are. And it's very heavy, so it's affecting families. Knowing that and letting that inform you is going to be helpful. But if you have a team, that's a blessing. But if you can work together as a team, because I think what happens is, in most cases, and it seems like that's the case here, is you've got a team, but really it's three solo artists trying to do their own thing. But if you can really come together and say, no, 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 we're blessed to have this team. How can we really allow each other to help one another inform how we speak to our congregation? So we've got our church here. We've got an understanding here. I'm not asking you to change who you are. I'm just saying, here's some things that we've got to consider if we're going to disciple our people. So that's another component. In order for discipleship to happen, you've got to know who you're speaking to. Speaking, communication, especially regularly when you're preaching, it's a avenue of discipleship. People are growing, people are being developed through that, right? So if you're going to do that, you're going to have to care about who's on the other side of what you're saying, because you can't effectively disciple them if you don't know who they are, where they're at, what they're going through.
Definitely. Awesome. We're coming to a close almost. We have just a question or two left. One of the questions was about authenticity. How do you communicate to people and you want to connect to them, but you don't want to come across as fake or contrived?
Yeah. Vulnerability,
Mm,
right? The way that you can be authentic is by being vulnerable. Talking about yourself, sharing about your struggles, being willing to open up and let people into your world. That's how you're going to be authentic, right? Because they need to see that what you're saying is connected to you, not disconnected from you, right? So if all I'm saying is theoretical and it's all this and it's all practical, but I'm not speaking about how it's all theoretical, it's all, theological, it's all up here, but I haven't talked about how it's connected to my life, right? People aren't going to be able to know and understand how I've wrestled with it, how I've processed it, right? I talked about, hey, if you're speaking on the topic of prayer, right? What do you want people to do, right? That action step. So if the action step that you're wanting is you want to help them to have an intimate relationship with the Father and to be able to pray from having that relationship, then what I've got to be able to do is be able to share how I've wrestled with that. Hey, there were times in my life I saw God as a judge, that I couldn't go to God because I didn't see him as a loving father. In fact, I would run from God because I was ashamed. I was, right? Begin sharing about who you are and letting people into your world. And that authenticity is revealed through vulnerability.
awesome. Yeah, that's definitely a difficult thing to do. It's almost like putting yourself out there. But I
Exactly.
guess that's the best way if people feel like, oh, I can really understand this guy.
That's how it gets beyond just the persona to the actual person, right? That's how you get people beyond that. And if you're going to connect with people, you're trying to bridge that gap, right, between the communicator and the audience, right? Again, when we talk about connection, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about, okay, when you're starting off, you've got your audience and you've got the communicator. And the goal is, how are you going to connect? And the only way that you're going to be able to do that is by knowing them, knowing where they're at. We talked about knowing their audience, and at the same time, then figuring out how you can connect with them. But that's being vulnerable. That's being, hey, I've wrestled with this. I've walked through this. I've gone through this. Just letting people into your world allows them to know, okay, that's who they are. Because I think what happens is there is a gap between the pulpit and the pew, right? And it's like, oh, okay, he's different. He's, she's different. They're different because they're not on the same level as we are. That's kind of the persona that people can give off. Like, oh, I don't struggle with this, but you do. Here's what you need to do, and here's the steps that you need to take. And it's this persona that you give off. But the way that you break down that barrier is allowing yourself to be open, allowing yourself to be vulnerable. That's bridging that gap and letting them see you are a real person. You do have the same issues. You're not holier than thou or on another level.
Awesome. Yeah. That vulnerability definitely connects with people. One of the challenges behind vulnerability though is sometimes I feel like or anyone who's speaking, like how will someone perceive me after I become vulnerable, or like
It's
how
true.
so that's one of the big struggles I think behind vulnerability. But I think once
Yeah.
you unlock that, it connects people. Did you have something to say?
Yeah, I was going to say what happens is, yes, you are, and it's different in different settings, right? What you're saying, how you're communicating it, how vulnerable you are. You've got to, again, know your audience, right? But what I was going to say was this: as hard as it may be to initially put it out there, what are they going to think? What are they going to feel? When someone comes up to you afterwards and tells you, thanks for sharing that, because that's my struggle, then that is where you're able to see, no, this works. Does that make sense? And you may not even get that, but you know that's where people are at because they're going through the same thing that you're going through. So by you being vulnerable, you're helping connect the dots for people and really meeting them right where they're at. So just think about it this way: your vulnerability is setting the way or setting the stage for a breakthrough in someone else's life, right? So I think that's the way that we've got to look at it. And I know for us, it's a shame-based culture. I struggled with it for a long time. It's hard, right? And I'm not saying I've perfected it. I mean, I grew up in our culture. I'm Indian, you know, it's a shame-based culture. What do people think? All those kind of things are there. But what we've got to do is we've got to see it in light of the bigger picture and say, if we're called to reach people, if we're called to connect with people, this is the means by which we can do it. Here's where I was. This is my story. This is what God has done. And now he can do the same for you.